My parents forced me to move out, so I bought the house next door to annoy them. And what happened next was both hilarious and totally unexpected. It's amazing! Alright, so you've heard of people moving out and getting their independence, right? But have you ever heard of someone moving out and then immediately buying the house next door just to mess with their parents? Yeah, I know this sounds like some petty revenge stuff, but trust me, you need to hear this story. My parents kicked me out because they thought I wasn't adult enough to live on my own, and I had the perfect idea on how to get back at them. Spoiler alert, it didn't go as they expected. Here's how I ended up buying the house next door to their place. Part 1. The "you're not ready" talk. So, let me set the scene for you. I've always been kind of a bit of a mama's boy, I guess. Not in the cringy way, but my parents and I were really close. I mean, like, we'd hang out every weekend, go out for Sunday brunch, and just spend a lot of time together. But as I got older, something changed. My mom would start dropping little comments like, "When are you going to find a real job?" Or, "Don't you think it's time to move out of your childhood room?" And I would laugh it off like, yeah, I'll get to it. But honestly, I wasn't in any rush to leave. My room had everything I needed. My bed, my Xbox, my snacks. Plus, I didn't have to pay rent, and life was just chill, you know? Then, one day, out of nowhere, my parents called me into the living room. Now, you gotta understand, my parents never called me into the living room for a serious conversation. If they wanted to talk, it was always over dinner or when we were casually hanging out. So, I knew something was up. I walk in, and both of them are sitting there looking, well, concerned. My dad speaks up first. "Son, it's time you moved out. You're not a kid anymore, and you need to start taking responsibility." My mom jumps in right after. "We love you, but we think you're getting too comfortable here. You're an adult now, and it's time to spread your wings." And here's the kicker. They weren't even giving me an option. It wasn't like, "Hey, what do you think about moving out?" No, it was, "It's time for you to go." And I'm sitting there like, wait, what? I'm comfortable here. Why are you suddenly kicking me out? They told me it wasn't that they didn't love me or want me around, but I needed to grow up, and that staying with them wasn't helping me be independent. I wasn't gonna lie. I was mad, like really mad. But also, a tiny part of me kind of understood what they were saying. I had been coasting for years, avoiding responsibilities and not really thinking about what was next in life. But still, I didn't think it was fair that they made the decision for me. So naturally I was like, fine, I'll move out. But here's where things took a little twist. Instead of getting the place I wanted, some cool apartment or a house in a trendy neighborhood, I decided I'd do something a little different. Part 2. The search for independence. After that awkward "you need to move out" talk, I started looking for places. I figured, okay, time to be an adult and find a cool apartment somewhere. But the more I looked, the more I realized how expensive everything was. Rent was crazy in the city, and honestly, I wasn't ready to drop all my cash on a tiny apartment with paper-thin walls. So I started thinking, what if I didn't need to move far? What if I just needed to move close? That's when the light bulb went off. Why not move into a place right near my parents so they could see how independent I was while still being able to annoy them a little? A classic power move, right? I started searching for houses in the neighborhood, and guess what I found? A house right across the street from my parents' place. It wasn't huge, but it was perfect. The yard was nice, the space was enough for me, and the price? Surprisingly decent. I could totally afford it. I'll admit, part of me was thinking about how mad my parents would be if I bought a house right next to theirs. Like, how could they complain that I wasn't independent enough if I owned a place of my own? So, without telling anyone, I pulled the trigger. I made an offer, and within weeks, I was officially the owner of a house right next door to my parents. I didn't tell them at first. I figured I'd let them figure it out when I moved in. Part 3. The big reveal. The day finally came when I moved into my new place. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine. I packed up some of my stuff, grabbed the essentials, and headed across the street. Now, here's the thing. My parents didn't know a thing about me buying the house. I didn't want to spoil the surprise, so I moved in like it was any other day. That evening, I was in the process of setting up my living room when I heard a knock on the door. Guess who it was? Yep, my parents. They walked over, and at first they didn't seem to notice the obvious. But then my mom's eyes widened, and she looked at the house and then at me. "Wait a minute. Is this your house?" she asked, clearly confused. I just smiled and said, Yep, this is my place now. My dad didn't say much, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. They were both silent for a second, probably processing the fact that I'd just bought a house, something they never thought I was capable of doing. I could almost hear them thinking, is this the same kid we had to force out of the house? It was the perfect moment. I could feel the satisfaction slowly bubbling up inside me, but then the question started coming. Why didn't you tell us? Why so close? And that's when it hit me. They weren't just surprised, they were annoyed. Annoyed that I had taken the idea of independence and twisted it into something they didn't expect. Part 4. The first week of living next door. The first week was interesting. My parents started showing up at my new house almost every day. They'd knock on my door like they were just checking in, but it was pretty obvious they were trying to figure out what I was doing over here. Honestly, it felt like they were expecting me to fail or something, like I wouldn't be able to make it on my own. One day, my mom popped over with a casserole, trying to act all casual. Just wanted to make sure you're eating, she said, as if I couldn't manage to heat up some frozen pizza by myself. I politely thanked her and told her I was fine, but deep down, I was kind of loving it. I mean, it was like they couldn't let go, and that made me feel a little bit victorious. But, of course, my parents had their own way of trying to help me settle in. The next day, my dad came over and tried to fix a faucet that didn't even need fixing. He'd knock on my door and say, "Hey, I noticed the faucet in your kitchen is a little loose. Let me just tighten it for you." I guess they were trying to be helpful, but it was more like a constant reminder that they didn't think I was capable of taking care of myself. Every time they came over, it made me realize how little they believed in my ability to handle things on my own. Part 5. The passive-aggressive comments. A couple of weeks went by, and things started to get awkward. My parents didn't give up on their daily check-ins. My mom would call, saying stuff like, "How's the new house? Are you surviving over there?" And don't even get me started on my dad. Every time I saw him, he'd throw in a little passive-aggressive comment like, you should probably mow your lawn. It's getting a bit wild. It wasn't even about the lawn. It was about the fact that they couldn't let go. They were still treating me like I was some clueless kid who needed constant supervision. And honestly, it got on my nerves. But what really got to me was when they tried to invite me back home for dinner every few days. Like, I'd already moved out, but they acted like I hadn't. One evening, my mom called and said, "We're having steak for dinner. You should come over and join us. You haven't had a proper meal in a while." At that point, I had to resist the urge to roll my eyes. It felt like they were still trying to take care of me, even though I was right next door. It was almost like they thought I'd come crawling back at any moment. So I started pulling back a little, making excuses not to come over. Part 6. The surprise visits. At this point, my parents were still popping by way too often, but I was starting to get a bit more creative with my responses. One day, my mom showed up with a basket of laundry saying, "I thought I'd help you out. You shouldn't be doing all your laundry by yourself." I swear, it was like they thought I was still their 12-year-old son, who didn't know how to function without them. I smiled politely, but inside, I was laughing at how ridiculous it all was. Then, the next day, my dad stopped by to tell me that my mailbox was tilting a little. I didn't even realize it, but he somehow found the time to come over and fix it. Honestly, it was starting to feel like they were running out of excuses to check on me, and that's when it hit me. They were so used to me being in their orbit, and now that I was living on my own, they didn't know how to handle it. So, they kept coming by, pretending like they were just being helpful, but it was clear they were struggling to let go. Part 7. The unexpected knock. Things started to take an even more unexpected turn when one evening I was just chilling on the couch, watching TV, when I heard a knock on my door. It was kind of late, and I figured it was probably a neighbor or someone from the neighborhood, but when I opened the door, it was my parents. Again. They didn't say anything at first, but the awkwardness was palpable. They were standing there, looking at me like they had something important to say, but neither of them spoke. Finally, my mom broke the silence with, "We're just checking in." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation. It was like they were trying to convince themselves that they were still needed in my life. I tried to keep it casual and said, "I'm good, guys. Really, everything's fine." But they lingered, standing in my doorway for what felt like forever. It was at that moment I realized this was no longer about them being helpful. It was about their fear of me actually being independent, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep up the whole "I'm doing fine" act. Part 8. The tension builds. As the weeks went on, the tension between my parents and me grew. Every time I saw them, there was this unspoken thing hanging in the air. They were still acting like I wasn't capable of handling life, and I was starting to get more annoyed by it. I'd hear things like, "You should really get your driveway repaved. It's starting to look bad." Or, "I can't believe you're living on your own. Are you sure you don't need help with anything?" At first I laughed it off, but the more they came over, the more I started feeling like a teenager again, constantly under their scrutiny. It was like I couldn't win. If I didn't ask for their help, they'd criticize me for not being responsible enough. If I let them help, they'd remind me I wasn't really independent. So, I decided to stop answering the door when they showed up unannounced. It was petty, but I needed some space, and guess what? That just made them show up even more. Part 9. The breaking point. One Saturday afternoon, I had just finished a long week of work and was looking forward to some peace and quiet. I was sitting on my porch with a cold drink when I saw my parents coming down the street. My heart sank. They were heading straight for my house again. This time, though, I was done with the whole checking in routine. I stayed inside, pretending I didn't hear the knock at my door. They knocked twice, then again, more urgently. When I didn't answer, they started looking around, peeking through the windows. Eventually, my mom called me on my phone asking, "Are you home?" I picked up and said, "Yeah, but I'm not really in the mood for visitors today." That's when things escalated. My dad got on the phone sounding frustrated. "You need to stop avoiding us. What's going on? We're just trying to help." It felt like the walls were closing in. I couldn't take it anymore. I said, "I'm an adult. I'm fine. Please stop treating me like I need you to come over every day." The silence on the other end was deafening. Then my mom quietly said, "Okay, we'll leave you alone." And just like that, it hit me. They didn't want to let go, and neither did I. Part 10. The realization and moving forward. A few days passed after that conversation, and honestly, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I didn't feel that constant pressure from my parents anymore, and I started realizing something. I didn't move out to annoy them. I did it to prove to myself that I could. But even though things were awkward, it was also clear that my parents didn't know how to handle me growing up. They still loved me, but I think they were scared of me actually becoming independent. That's something I hadn't fully understood until I moved across the street. Eventually, my parents stopped showing up so often, but they'd still call to check in. And as time went on, they started respecting my space more. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I don't know if they'll ever fully let go, but I've learned to set boundaries, and they've learned to back off a little. As for me, I've realized that becoming independent isn't just about living on your own. It's about finding a balance between your own life and your family's love. If there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's that independence is a journey. It's not always smooth, and sometimes it's messy. But if you're like me, trying to figure out how to balance family and your own space, don't be afraid to set those boundaries. If you're dealing with parents who are a little too involved or trying to push you out of your comfort zone, it's okay to take a step back, breathe, and figure out your own path. What do you think? Have you ever been in a situation where your parents just couldn't let go? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.